Hi everyone, this is Neil. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doodling a few hanging plants, and I'm going to first start by sketching out a few ideas for the shape of the pots. The sketchbook that I have is square, so I'm going to be painting 3 plants in each page as a double page spread, and I just want to sketch out a few different shapes of the pots that I can paint later on. You can draw as many as you would like and then pick the ones that you would like to include in your painting. Once I'm done with the ideation, I want to only sketch the pots thinly on my sketchbook. You might not need to do this, but I'm not very good with spacing, so this will act as a guide with the placement of each plant for me. And as for the plants, I'm just going to paint them straight on my paper later on, without the stress of figuring out the spacing. Once I'm done with sketching all of the pots, I'm going to start with the first one. I'm using a mixture of Terra Verde and Permanent Yellow Deep, and I'm just going to use the tip of my brush to paint in different angles to create sort of like a bushy texture. I'm using a medium consistency of this light color so I can build up the color later on as I go. Towards the edges of this bush, I want the texture to be a bit more wispy and spread out, so it doesn't look like a silhouette of a certain shape, but more of a natural placement. Next, I'm going to use a mixture of Quin Rose and Jaune Brilliant No. 2 to create a soft but vibrant pink, and I'm going to again randomly use the tip of my brush to paint loose abstract flowers in the negative spaces of the bush texture. But if you don't have much negative space, you can also wait for the previous layer to dry and paint the pink dots on top of the dry paint, but it just won't be as vibrant as this one because the green from the previous layer will show through. Once the base layer is somehow a little bit more dry, at least it's not puddling wet, I'm going to add on a slightly darker green by using more Terra Verde in the mixture, but I'm also going to change up the ratio and use different tones of green by just using the same 2 colors. And I'm going to create the same texture as before, but I'm going to leave out more negative space this time, so it gives a little bit more depth to the bush. I think the first one is fairly done. It's just a doodle, so I don't want to overwork it. And as for the next one, I'm going to start by creating a dark green mixture using Prussian blue with Terra Verde. And I'm starting with a fairly thick consistency, so I can use the tip of my brush to paint thin vines by wiggling my brush. I'm only going to paint a few of these so I don't end up overcrowding the space. Then once I'm done with the vines, I'm going to add leaves, and I'm just going to keep this simple by playing with the angles only, but I'm not going to worry about folds and things like that, so it's very nice and simple to paint. As I'm painting the leaves, I don't want them to be too crowded and close together or touching at this point. I just want them to be separate because I'm going to use a thinner consistency as a different value on the next layer. This one is going to be really repetitive as there are a few leaves that I would need to paint. So if you're going to paint along to this, just relax and have fun with this one. I think I've covered most of the area here, so I want to start using the lighter color, which is a mixture of permanent yellow deep and terra verde, but this time I'm going to use a thin consistency, so I added lots of water to create a very light green. And don't worry if you think it's going to be a bit too light, because it's actually going to pick up some of the color of the darker green from the previous layer if it touches, and the paint is going to travel slightly to the wet area of the light green. I tried to paint the lighter leaves between the darker green leaves, and I tried to still vary the angle and sometimes overlap them so the leaves still look flowy even if we're not using folds or even foreshortened angles for this plant. Moving on to the next one, I'm going to paint simplified ZZ plants using a mix of permanent green number 2 with permanent yellow deep. And I'm going to use a thick consistency to paint the stems first and the leaves on either side of the stems. I'm using the same shape for the leaves, but I just made them larger in size in comparison to the previous plant. I'm only starting with 3 stems first because I don't want the leaves to be touching with each other, so I do need space in between, and I'm going to wait for the layer to dry completely before adding more so the paint won't blend into each other. After painting the 3 stems, I think that I would only need one more to fill in the space, so I'm just going to use the same color and the same consistency to paint the last one. Moving on to the next one, I'm going to take the dark green color that I've already mixed on my palette. It doesn't matter what mixture, I just use a thick consistency to create separate lines and slightly changing up the angle to create sort of like a radial pattern. And then I used a mixture of yellow ochre, permanent yellow deep, and also permanent green number 2. And then using a light consistency, I'm just going to wiggle my brush on either side and fill in the rest to create a long leaf. I'm going to do the same for all of the lines, so I follow the different angles that I've initially painted. After painting all of the leaves, I'm going to wait for it to dry and use a slightly darker value of the same mix by adding more permanent green number 2 in the ratio and paint the leaves in between the ones that I've already painted, but I'm only going to do this for the areas with larger spacing. For this next one, I'm going to paint string of pearls, which are just basically tiny circles. I'm going to start by using a dark green mixture from terra verde, Prussian blue, and also a bit of permanent yellow deep. And I'm going to start drawing out the vines with the tip of my brush using a thick consistency so I can keep the lines nice and thin. Then adding more permanent yellow deep in the mixture, I'm just going to start by drawing out the tiny circles. I only want to use one brush for this, so I'm sticking with mine, but you can also switch to a smaller brush for better control if you need to. Like usual, I'm going to keep the distance between all the circles and build it up later on to avoid shapes merging together. Then after this layer, I'm going to fill in the space in between using a lighter consistency to separate the shapes even if they're touching. Towards the bottom of the vines, I like to only draw the tiny little dots instead of continuing with the line of the vine to make the tips look more delicate, so I'm going to do that for some of them. Finally, onto the last plant. I want this to be a light purple color, so I'm going to use cobalt violet light. Firstly, to paint the soft stems on the sides to remind myself that I want the leaves to flow downwards slightly. Then I'm going to use the same application as the first plant by creating that bushy texture with the tip of my brush and also by varying the angles. I'm going to leave this out to dry now, and meanwhile I'm going to use a mixture of permanent green number 2 with permanent yellow deep to create a light yellow-green color, and I'm going to use the same application to paint in between the bushy texture that I just painted. Since the colors are fairly light for now, I want to also build the depth by adding mineral violet to the cobalt violet light to give this plant some shadows, and I'm just going to slowly build it up until I'm satisfied with the overall shape of the plant. At this point, I have painted all of the plants, but I just want to add some additional touch-ups. So for the second plant here, I want to add a bit of pink so the color pop out a little bit more. And as for the string of pearls, I want to add a very thick consistency dark green from a mixture of Terre Verde and Prussian blue to add a few additional dots. Now onto the pots. I'm just going to keep this simple, and you can use any color you want, but I'll just mention mine in case you want to use the same. I want to create a terracotta color, so I use a mixture of vermilion with yellow ochre and cadmium orange to first paint the base color. And I don't want the colors to be completely even, so I'm intentionally making the colors dark on some parts to give more interest and a bit of texture. Then I'm also going to add burnt umber to some of the darker corners for extra depth and definition. I'm just going to jump around here, so I'm going to use buff titanium to paint the base color of the second pot. Then I'm going to add sepia to the buff titanium to add lines on top of that flat color. For the first one, I'm going to start with burnt umber. I'm trying to create that uneven texture again and also leaving out a bit of white negative space. And while the surface is still wet, I'm going to use sepia to place it randomly and use a bit of that orangey brown color from the third pot to give a slight vibrancy to the color. For the fourth pot, I'm going to use yellow ochre as the base color to make it slightly golden. Then at the bottom and at the top, I'm going to add a touch of burnt umber while the surface is still wet, so it's just going to blend together nicely. The fifth pot is supposed to be glass, so I thought of using gray of gray, but after painting it as a flat color to make it simple, I didn't really like it. I think I would actually use this gray of gray to show a shiny surface by following the curve as you paint and leaving a lot of white negative space. So I would definitely suggest for you to try to create that glassy texture instead of just doing this flat color like I did. Then I just outlined the shape using Prussian blue mixed with the gray of gray to finish this one off. For the last pot, I'm going to use buff titanium mixed with a bit of sepia, and I'm going to create the same uneven texture as before. As for the bottom, I decided to make the color darker, so I added more sepia on top of the initial color, and I also used the same dark brown for a touch of cast shadow underneath the leaves. This is optional, but I decided to also add some random patterns or textures on top of the pots using this white jelly roll pen, but you can also use things like colored pencils or colored pens for additional detail if you would like to. Now I'm going to add the hangers or the rope using a brown pen, but you can also just use ordinary black pen. And I'm going to make random shapes and making stuff up as I go without prior planning. So I think you guys can do much better than me. But for more ideas, you can also use reference photos. I'm also sorry that my hand is going to be covering the lines that I'm making. I tend to grip my pen this way for more control, but I kept forgetting that it blocks the camera. So hopefully these are simple enough lines for you to still follow along too. After drawing these out, I thought they looked a bit too thin in comparison to the plants, so I decided to double up some of the lines to make the strokes a bit thicker, and that's pretty much it for these hanging plant doodles. Like usual, all of the list of tools as well as my social media links will be listed in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!